March 23, 1978. Philadelphia was already asleep. Not fully asleep. More like the city was pretending. Streetlights hummed. A late bus sighed at an empty stop. Somewhere, a factory kept breathing, slow and mechanical. And in a converted warehouse on the north side, a small AM station stayed awake for the people who could not. Inside that building, one room was always lit. A broadcast booth with tired walls, a control board that had seen better decades, 3 phone lines that could turn a quiet night into a confession booth.
And one man, alone, with a microphone, Daniel Westbrook, or as most listeners knew him, Danny West. The voice that drifted through bedrooms and truck cabs, through hospitals, in 24-hour diners, through the thin space between midnight and morning. He had done this for almost 12 years, long enough to stop being nervous, long enough to stop pretending the red light mattered, long enough to realize the job was not about music, it was about presence. At 1:45 in the morning, people did not want a DJ. They wanted proof that the world had not abandoned them.
Daniel was good at that, not because he was charming, not because he was loud, because he sounded real. That night, he settled into the routine like he always did. Headphones on, coffee close, playlist ready. Outside the booth, Philadelphia stretched into darkness. Inside, the world narrowed to 2 things: music and the phone. He had a way of taking calls that made strangers feel safe. A truck driver missing home, a student fighting exhaustion, an older man who called every Friday and never said much, just wanted one song that reminded him of someone he lost. Daniel listened. He responded gently. He kept the night moving. But if you had been in that booth with him, you would have noticed something else. Even in the calm, there was tension. Not in the room, in the era. Because 1978 was not just another year. It was a year when the Cold War did not feel like history. It felt like weather. You did not always see it, but you lived under it. You heard it in the news. You felt it in the way people talked about Moscow, in the way politicians spoke about national strength, in the way airports and ports tightened their rules, quietly, without explanation, and in the way intelligence agencies on both sides never stopped searching for the simplest advantage. That is the part most people forget. They imagine espionage as fancy gadgets and secret meetings, but the real Cold War thrived on ordinary things: a mailbox, a payphone, a newspaper ad, a routine that no one questioned. And that is why what happened in Daniel's booth is so unsettling, because it did not begin with a chase. It began with a song request.
At 1:15, the phone rang again. Daniel did not rush. He never rushed. He finished the sentence he was speaking on air, guided the listeners into the next record, and only then picked up. He expected warmth, or at least something human. Instead, he heard a voice that sounded like it had been trained, male, flat, careful, each word placed like a piece on a chessboard. "I would like to request a song." The accent was faint, not strong enough to name, just enough to feel out of place. Daniel leaned closer, pen ready.
"Sure," he said. "What are we listening to tonight?" The caller did not answer the question. He did not say hello. He did not say please in the way Americans said please. He simply delivered information. "Please play Blue Moon by the Marcells, then Calendar Girl by Neil Sedaka, then Runaround Sue by Dion. In that order, no interruption." Daniel paused. 3 songs was not strange. Oldies were not strange. People requested all kinds of things late at night, but the insistence felt wrong. Daniel tried to do what he always did, make it personal. "All right," he said. "And who's this from?" "That is not necessary." "Okay," Daniel said, slower now. "Any dedication?" "No dedication is necessary. Just the songs, in that order." There was a short silence, like the man was waiting for confirmation that Daniel understood the assignment. Daniel looked at the clock on the wall. 1:15. Almost exactly. He swallowed. "All right," he said. "I'll put them on. Thank you."
The line went dead.
Daniel stayed still for a moment, receiver in his hand, listening to nothing. A quiet hiss on the line, the sound of absence. He set the phone down. In the booth, the record played on. The familiar voice in his headphones was his own, calm and steady, as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had shifted. It was hard to describe. Not fear, exactly. More like a thin discomfort that slid under the skin. He told himself the obvious explanations. A lonely man who did not like small talk. Someone new to English. Someone who did not want their name on air. Daniel had learned not to judge callers. Late-night radio brought out people's private oddities, and most of the time, those oddities were harmless. So he wrote the 3 titles on his pad. He placed the records near the turntable. He waited until the moment felt right. And just after 2, he did what he promised. He played them back to back. Blue Moon first. As the opening notes filled the booth, Daniel watched the needle trace the groove. A small circle repeating itself. A motion that could keep going all night if no one stopped it. Calendar Girl came next, and then Runaround Sue. 3 songs that sounded innocent to anyone half asleep. 3 songs that could pass as nostalgia. 3 songs that would drift across Philadelphia like dust. And somewhere out there, Daniel suddenly realized, someone might be listening with intention. That thought came and went fast. He pushed it away. He took another call. He read another dedication. He guided another lonely listener toward morning. But the strange voice stayed in his mind. Not because it was aggressive, not because it threatened him, because it sounded empty. It sounded like a message, not a request. Like the man was not asking for music, he was checking a box. And that bothered Daniel in a way he could not explain. When the shift ended at 6, he stepped outside into pale light and cold air. Philadelphia looked normal again. People started their cars. Newspapers landed on stoops. A city waking up. Daniel walked to his own car, tired, ready for sleep. And as he drove home, he caught himself doing something he had not done before. He kept checking the rearview mirror. Not because he saw anything, because he felt watched. Hours later, in his apartment, Daniel lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He told himself it was one odd caller, one weird request, nothing more. And yet, he could not stop thinking about the exactness of it. The precision was what made it hard to ignore. That is what made it hard to ignore. A pattern begins as a single line. You only recognize it after it repeats. Daniel did not know it yet, but he was about to hear that voice again. Next Friday, the same time. And the second call would make the first call feel like a warning. The second call came exactly 1 week later. Daniel did not need to look at the clock to know the time. His body already knew. 1:15 in the morning. The phone rang with the same short, impatient sound. Not the hesitant ring of someone unsure whether to call. Not the excited ring of someone who wanted to talk. It rang like a signal. Daniel finished his sentence on air, eased the record into its groove, and picked up the receiver. "Hello, you're on Midnight Requests." There was no greeting. "I would like to request 3 songs. The voice was the same. Flat, controlled, unemotional. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. "All right," he said. "Go ahead. Teenager in Love by Dion and the Belmonts, then Save the Last Dance for Me by the Drifters, then The Twist by Chubby Checker. Play them in that order, with no interruption." No pause, no hesitation, no warmth. Daniel waited, just long enough to see if the man would add anything. Nothing came. "Who should I say this is from?" Daniel asked. "That is not necessary." "Any dedication?" "No dedication, thank you." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone again, feeling a faint chill move through him. 2 weeks in a row. Same time, same delivery. This was no longer a coincidence. He played the songs later that night, exactly as requested. He did not miss a beat. He did not let his voice betray his thoughts. But this time, he listened differently. Between calls, between records, Daniel began to replay the interactions in his mind. Not emotionally, clinically.
The caller never spoke unless necessary, never responded to small talk, never corrected Daniel, never reacted. He behaved like someone who expected compliance.
And Daniel could not ignore how precise everything was. The timing, the sequence, the insistence. People who called late-night radio were messy. They rambled, they overshared, they forgot what they wanted to say. This man did none of that. The third call came the following Friday, 1:15. Different songs, same structure. The fourth call followed, then the fifth. By the sixth week, Daniel had stopped telling himself it was strange. Strange implied random. This was not random. It was deliberate. So he started doing something new. He kept a log. Not officially, not as part of his job, just a yellow legal pad he kept under the console.
Date, time, song titles, order. He wrote down everything. He noticed that the songs always came from a narrow window, early 1960s, before the British invasion, before the sound changed. He noticed that the caller never repeated a sequence, never reused the same combination. And he noticed something else, the accent. At first, Daniel had thought it sounded Eastern European, but after listening carefully, week after week, he began to realize that it was oddly neutral, as if the man was suppressing it, as if he had been trained to flatten his voice, to sand away the edges that might give him away. That detail unsettled Daniel more than the rest.
Because you did not accidentally erase an accent. You practiced it. Daniel had not worked in intelligence, but he had worked in communications. Years earlier, in the Army Signal Corps, he had been taught that information was not just content, it was timing, structure, delivery. A message was not always what was said. Sometimes it was how it was sent. And this felt like a message. Daniel began to wonder who else was listening.
Not his usual audience. Not the truck drivers and students and insomniacs. Someone else. Someone who knew exactly when to tune in. Someone who did not care about the music. Someone who only cared that the sequence reached them intact. That thought followed Daniel home now. He found himself lowering the volume when he listened to his own show from his kitchen radio, as if the walls might hear. He slept poorly, waking at odd hours with the sense that something was wrong. Once, driving to the station, he took a different route without realizing why. That realization made his stomach tighten. Predictability was useful. That was the point. The calls continued. Always Friday. Always 1:15. By the seventh week, Daniel no longer needed to check the log to know what was coming. He could feel it building as the hour approached. When the phone rang that night, he did not flinch. But after he hung up, he did something he had never done before. He rewound the tape. The station recorded broadcasts for internal review. Most DJs never listened to themselves. Daniel rarely did. This time, he sat alone in the booth and listened to the call again. The words were the same, but hearing them detached from the moment changed something. The pauses were too clean, the cadence too controlled. This was not conversation, it was transmission.
Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. If this was a code, he had no idea how to read it. But he did not need to. That was not his role. His role, whether he wanted it or not, was simpler. He was the medium. And that was when the thought finally settled into place. If these requests were coded messages, then his radio show was being used as a delivery system, a public channel, a perfect disguise. Anyone could listen. No one would suspect. And that meant something else. It meant that whoever was behind this trusted the system, trusted the routine, trusted that Daniel would keep doing his job exactly as he always had. The realization brought a strange weight with it.
Daniel had always thought of his work as harmless, comforting, a service. Now he wondered if it was dangerous, not to him, to someone else. He did not sleep at all that day. By the time Friday night came again, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just odd, and the longer he played along without understanding what was happening, the more complicit he might become. But reporting it meant crossing a line, one that could not be uncrossed, and Daniel was not ready for that yet, not until he was sure.
not until the pattern became undeniable. And that moment was closer than he realized. Daniel had learned, during his time in uniform, that doubt was dangerous. Not the loud kind of doubt, the quiet kind. The kind that sat in the back of your mind and waited. It was the same feeling he had now. The calls kept coming, week after week, unchanged. 1:15, 3 songs, no name, no dedication.
Daniel no longer asked questions when the phone rang. He already knew the answers, and that frightened him more than the calls themselves, because patterns, once recognized, demanded a response. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, a memory from training, a sentence from a briefing long forgotten, a late-night thought that refused to stay buried. In the Army Signal Corps, Daniel had learned that communication was rarely about what was visible. It was about what blended in. A signal hidden inside noise was the safest signal of all, and there was no greater noise than American life. Radio shows, advertisements, music drifting through open windows. Nobody questioned those things. Daniel found himself thinking about that as he sat in the public library one afternoon, flipping through books he had not planned to read. Codes, ciphers, cryptography. Not because he expected to crack anything, but because he needed to understand whether what he was seeing was even plausible. The answer came faster than he expected. Number stations.
The term appeared again and again in different sources. Mysterious broadcasts, shortwave signals, voices reading strings of numbers, music used as markers, messages sent one way, impossible to trace, perfect for spies operating deep undercover. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as he read. This was not fiction. This was doctrine. The principle was elegant. A spy did not need to transmit anything. He only needed to listen. And if caught, he could not be forced to reveal a message he never physically possessed. Daniel closed the book and leaned back in his chair. He could already see the adaptation. Why use shortwave radio when commercial radio was everywhere? Why risk attention when you could hide inside routine? A radio DJ played what he was told. Millions heard it. Only one person understood it. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. If this was happening, then he was not an observer. He was infrastructure. That night, back in the booth, the red light seemed brighter than usual, the microphone heavier. Every time he spoke, he wondered how many people were listening, not just to him, but to what he was unknowingly carrying. The phone rang at 1:15. Daniel answered without hesitation. The request came. 3 songs, different titles, same structure. As he wrote them down, he noticed his hand shaking slightly. He played the songs later, his voice steady on air, his mind racing underneath. This time he imagined the listener, not the caller, the receiver. Someone sitting alone, radio tuned precisely, notebook open, waiting, decoding. Daniel had always imagined his audience as lonely but harmless. Now he wondered what instructions might be unfolding in the quiet of someone else's home. Meet someone, pick something up, pass something on. The danger was not in the songs. It was in what came after.
Daniel sat alone in the booth long after his shift ended, staring at the log he had kept. 7 weeks, 7 sequences. That was enough. But certainty brought fear. If he was right, reporting this meant inviting the federal government into his life. It meant scrutiny, questions, possibly danger. And if he was wrong, he would become a joke, a late-night DJ who saw spies where there were none. Daniel thought about doing nothing, and realized that doing nothing was also a choice. He did not call anyone that night. He needed time. But from that moment on, Daniel stopped thinking of the calls as strange. He thought of them as operational. And that changed everything. Because once you understand that something is deliberate, you cannot unknow it. Daniel waited 3 more days, not because he was indecisive, because he was afraid. Fear had a way of clarifying things. It stripped away excuses, left only intent. On Monday morning, with the city fully awake and ordinary again, Daniel picked up the phone in his kitchen and dialed a number he had memorized but never expected to use: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Philadelphia Field Office. His voice sounded smaller than usual when he asked to speak to someone in counterintelligence. There was a pause, a transfer, then another voice, professional, alert, listening. Daniel explained slowly, carefully. He did not use words like spy or code at first. He described patterns, timing, behavior. He described the voice. When he finished, there was silence on the line. Not disbelief, consideration. "How long has this been happening?" the man asked. 7 weeks, Daniel said. "Every Friday, 1:15 in the morning. Do not play the next request."
The words were calm, but urgent. "If he calls again, take the information. Tell him you will play the songs, but do not broadcast them. We need to meet." Daniel felt the weight of it settle instantly. This was not curiosity. This was confirmation. That afternoon, he found himself in a small conference room inside a federal building he had passed 100 times without noticing. The agent introduced himself as Robert Kellerman. Compact, controlled, eyes that missed nothing. Kellerman listened without interrupting. He took notes. He asked questions about the accent, the cadence, the exact wording. When Daniel finished, Kellerman closed his notebook and studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Westbrook," he said, "what I am about to tell you does not leave this room."
Daniel nodded. Kellerman slid several photographs across the table. A man with an unremarkable face, different glasses, different posture, different expressions. Someone designed to be forgettable. "We believe your radio show has been used as a one-way communication channel," Kellerman said, "a variation of a known Soviet tradecraft method." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Music stations," Kellerman continued. "We have documented similar techniques overseas. Commercial infrastructure is ideal. Nobody questions it." Daniel looked down at the photos again. "You think he's calling me? We think someone is, and we think someone else is listening."
Daniel leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how small his role had been until now, and how large it had become. For the first time, he felt exposed. From that day forward, Daniel lived 2 lives. On the surface, nothing changed. Midnight requests went on as always. Same tone, same warmth, same routines. Underneath, everything was different. The FBI installed recording equipment on the phone lines. They photographed the exterior of the building. They monitored broadcasts in real time. Daniel was told not to change his behavior. Routine was protection. But routine was also the weapon being used against him. Each Friday night, when the phone rang at 1:15, Daniel's pulse quickened. He took the calls. He wrote down the requests. He promised to play the songs. And then he did exactly what he was told. He played them, knowing now what they might represent.
Somewhere in Philadelphia, or perhaps beyond it, someone was listening, decoding, acting. Daniel did not know who. That ignorance gnawed at him. He began to notice small things: a car parked across the street longer than usual, footsteps in the stairwell that stopped when he opened the door, a click on the phone line at home. Kellerman assured him these were precautions, not threats, but reassurance only went so far. Weeks passed. The FBI identified possible listeners: a scientist, a contractor, a port employee. Daniel was never told details. He did not want them. What he could not escape was the knowledge that his voice was now part of an investigation that reached far beyond a radio booth. He had become an unwitting asset, and assets were never meant to be seen.
The strain began to show. Daniel lost weight. He slept in fragments. He found himself rehearsing conversations that never happened. What if they knew? What if they had realized the channel was compromised? But the calls never stopped. That, more than anything, convinced Daniel that the operation was still invisible. The enemy trusted the system. That trust would become their mistake. By the time June arrived, Daniel no longer marked the days on his calendar. He marked the nights. Friday nights. That was when the war passed through his booth. Always quietly, always politely, always disguised as nostalgia. The FBI did not tell Daniel everything. They did not need to. What he knew was enough. Someone was listening. Someone was acting. And the radio show was still their bridge.